So I ran out of time on the last one, and I just wanted to cover these last two slides for people who missed class today. So the last slide we were talking about, just a refresher, biomagnification or bioaccumulation, how the top consumer would be the most affected by a toxin because the top consumer eats everything beneath them, and those toxins then build up in the organisms, so everything they eat, it magnifies the effect. So this was some sample questions I wanted to show you. So the first one says, name a primary consumer. So the first thing you need to remember is the primary consumer is the first one to eat the producers. So these are your producers, the seaweed and the plankton, the plant plankton would be your producers. So your primary consumers would be the shrimp, the chitin, and the mussel, because these are all the herbivores, the ones that are eating these producers directly. The second question says, if a seaweed contained a metal poison, which organism would end up with the most metal stored in their body? I would say you would want to pick, obviously, somebody at the very top of the food chain, so the seagull would be a good guess. Technically, in this particular food chain, I think the starfish may actually end up worse off because the starfish is getting food from, it's eating the ones, the chitin eats the seaweed, then the rock cod, and then the starfish. So I think the starfish and the seagull, but you definitely want to pick a top consumer is the idea, because they're going to get all the toxins that have built up in the seaweed and everything that ate the seaweed. And then finally, if all the chitins died, which is these guys here, who would be most affected? Now, obviously, everybody might eventually be affected, but the first ones to be affected would be the crabs and the rock cod, because the crabs and the rock cod eat the chitins directly, and therefore they would have no food. And then from there, obviously they might die, which might affect other things. Also, a question I could ask you, what level here would have the most energy? And so here, keep in mind that it would not be the top, because you might think, oh, but a seagull eats so many of the other things. No, the energy would be down here at the bottom. The seaweed and the plant plankton would contain the most energy because, remember, they're your producers, and only 10% of their energy is getting passed on to the shrimp, and only 10% of that is getting passed on to the sea anemone. So, and only 10, etc. So the most energy would be down here at the bottom. In fact, if you added up the energy of all the chitins and shrimp, it would still not equal the energy of the seaweed. Because if only 10% was passed on, it's not going to be as much. So the more energy is near the bottom. Okay, and then this last little section is on ecological succession. So ecological succession is sort of the development of an ecosystem from scratch. So primary succession is what we call it when there was never anything living there ever before. Primary succession. The textbook example of this is you have a volcano explode and it creates a brand new volcanic island where there was water before, you now have land. So primary succession would be the transformation of that land from barren rock into a final community. So what do you need to know about succession? You should know that the first things that grow are called pioneer plants or pioneer organisms, and it is pretty much always moss and lichen. Moss and lichen are things that grow on rocks, so you don't have to have soil for them. So if you imagine a volcanic island, there's no soil, so you can't have plants. So the first things to grow would be the moss and the lichen. Not only do they grow on rock, but when they grow on rock, they produce acids that break the rock down. That will then make soil. So these are called your pioneer plants, and when they create soil, now you can have grasses start to grow, seeds can sprout that may appear there, small animals may come in, bringing bigger seeds for bigger plants, and so this progresses over time. The final community, which does not have to be hardwood trees, this is just an example, is called the climax community. So the climax community is sort of the final stable community at the end of succession. So primary succession, you start from scratch, a volcanic island, it's all rock. The pioneer plants are the moss and lichen, they break down the rock into soil, which then paves the way to the other plants coming along and animals and things like that, and eventually your final community is called your climax community. Secondary succession is what we call it when a land is coming back from a fire or an earthquake or something. It's still going from scratch. If there's a big fire in the Everglades and it burns up an area of trees, you're going to basically be left with barren soil. It's going to maybe take years for that to grow back, first some grasses and things like that, and eventually that'll be replaced by, again, the climax community. The difference is just that secondary succession means there was stuff growing there before. This is a recovery versus primary succession, where this is sort of like virgin territory that nothing ever grew in that area before. So those are the last two slides I wanted to go over. And since there's time on here, and you don't have to listen to this, you can turn it off if you want to, I'll go over the problems that I skipped. I had skipped these last two problems. Won't be on the test. But for the AP exam, again, net productivity versus gross productivity. So gross productivity is, remember, the total of all the I guess, biomass that's made by photosynthesis. If you subtract from that what the plant uses for cell respiration, you would get your net productivity. So this says if the net productivity was 8,000 kilocalories per meter, so this is our net they're giving us, and the respiration rate was 12,000 kilocalories per meter, what was the original gross primary productivity? So since the gross minus what they use for respiration is the net, this is a pretty easy problem to solve. The gross is basically going to be equal to 8,000 plus the 12,000 from the respiration, and so the gross would be 20,000, and then our units would just be kilocalories per meter squared. Now, this second question, they do this kind of thing a lot on the AP exam just to see if you understand the concepts and can manipulate numbers. So if our gross primary productivity is 20,000 kilocalories per square meter, they want to know if the ecosystem consists of 500 square meters, what would be the total kilocalories produced? Well, if it's 20,000 for every 1 square meter, then if we just multiply it by the total number of square meters of the area, our meters will cancel, and we will have how many kilocalories the whole ecosystem would make, rather than just per meter. So when you multiply that out, I believe you get 10 million. And this would just be kilocalories because our per meter canceled. So just wanted to go ahead and do those two problems since there wasn't enough time in the first video to do that. And the last section we're going to cover in class tomorrow is animal behavior.